At dawn on August 7, 1942, the sea around Guadalcanal boiled with American steel. Battleships and transports stretched across the horizon, their silhouettes hazy in the mist, rising from the warm Pacific waters. Engines thundered, landing craft slashed through surf, and young Marines clutched rifles slick with sweat. From the shoreline, Japanese sentries rubbed their eyes in disbelief. The enemy had arrived not with a probing raid, but with a storm of men, machines, and resolve. The island that Imperial Japan had fortified as a forward bastion was suddenly under siege. To Japanese commanders in Tokyo, the very idea was laughable. America, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, could not possibly mount such an ambitious counteroffensive this soon. Yet the impossible was happening before their eyes. U.S. Navy log, Aug. 1942. For months, the Japanese military had considered the Solomons chain their stepping stone toward Australia. They had built an airstrip on Guadalcanal's northern coast, meant to sever Allied lifelines across the South Pacific. The plan appeared flawless. By mid-1942, Japan controlled an empire that spanned nearly 3,000 miles, from Burma to the Gilberts, from Manchuria to New Guinea. The rising sun seemed unstoppable, and their generals mocked the notion that American forces could claw back even a fragment of it. Imperial Army Staff Report, June 1942. But beneath the arrogance, cracks were already forming. The Japanese High Command, steeped in the Bushido Code and the victories of 1941, underestimated the vast industrial power now awakened in the United States. Where Japan measured its shipyards in handfuls, America measured them in scores. Where Japan produced dozens of planes a month, American factories were rolling out thousands. Still, in the summer of 1942, raw numbers were not yet on display. Instead, it was strategy, unexpected, unnerving, that began to shift the tides. War Production Board Bulletin, 1942. On Guadalcanal's beaches, Marines plunged ashore through crashing waves. The jungle loomed before them like a wall of green fire, alive with heat and insects. Every rustle carried the possibility of an ambush. Radios crackled, men shouted over the roar of naval gunfire, and smoke from burning palm huts rolled inland. Somewhere beyond the trees lay Henderson Field, the half-finished Japanese airstrip that was the prize of this bloody gamble. If captured, it could become the Allies' unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Solomons. If lost, it would remain a dagger aimed at Australia's throat. U.S. Marine Corps Report, Aug. 1942. The Japanese defenders at first believed the attack a diversion. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had assured his staff that America would not strike for years. When reports reached Tokyo that U.S. Marines were not only ashore but advancing inland, senior officers scoffed. "They are bluffing," one colonel remarked, his tone dripping with contempt. To them, American troops were soft, mechanized workers, not warriors. They had not yet seen how those same workers, hardened by depression and now fueled by vengeance, would fight when the survival of their nation was on the line. Imperial Army Diary, Aug. 1942. In Washington, however, the move was anything but a bluff. General Douglas MacArthur had warned that the Allies needed an aggressive counterstroke to halt Japan's momentum. Admiral Chester Nimitz agreed. Together they envisioned a brutal but deliberate strategy, leapfrogging across the Pacific, bypassing strongholds and seizing only what was necessary to tighten the noose around Japan. It was not the obvious choice. Many Allied leaders favored a slower attritional advance, but Nimitz's island-hopping plan promised speed, efficiency, and a psychological edge that numbers alone could not explain. Joint Chiefs Minutes, July 1942. By September, the Japanese response to Guadalcanal was frantic yet fragmented. Reinforcements sailed from Rabaul under cover of night. Tokyo ordered repeated banzai charges into the jungle, waves of infantry attempting to overwhelm the American perimeter. Each assault broke against dug-in Marines, their Browning machine guns stitching fire through the darkness. Corpses piled in the mud, and the Japanese survivors slinked back into the jungle, stunned that the weak Americans had held fast. U.S. Army After Action Report, set 1942. Still, the battle was far from secure. At sea, Japanese cruisers and destroyers prowled the waters like wolves, delivering midnight bombardments that shook the earth and lit the sky in crimson arcs. U.S. transports were sunk, supplies were scarce, and men rationed their bullets and beans. Hunger gnawed at Marines as much as enemy fire. Some called Guadalcanal Starvation Island, Yet even in their deprivation, they endured, clutching the fragile airstrip that became Henderson Field, from which the Cactus Air Force would rise to challenge Japanese skies. Naval War Diary. By 1942, Tokyo's laughter began to fade. What had been dismissed as American folly became a quagmire draining Japanese strength. General Harukichi Hyakutake, commanding the 17th Army, warned his superiors that Guadalcanal was becoming a graveyard of soldiers and ships. But the high command in Tokyo could not admit weakness. They poured more men into the grinder, convinced that one decisive effort could sweep the Americans into the sea. Instead, every reinforcement convoy, mockingly nicknamed the Tokyo Express, ran a gauntlet of submarines, aircraft, and naval gunfire. Losses mounted, morale withered, and still the Americans held. Japanese Army Dispatch. Nov 1942. By early 1943, the once confident boasts of Japanese generals were replaced by grim silence. Guadalcanal had become the first domino to topple. Japan's aura of invincibility was shattered. Yet even then they failed to grasp the deeper reality. Guadalcanal was not an isolated clash. It was the opening move of a grander design, an island-hopping campaign that would carry U.S. forces across the Pacific in less than 2 years. A strategy born of necessity, sustained by engineering brilliance and executed with relentless resolve. The Japanese generals who had laughed at America's supposed weakness now faced a nightmare. Their fortified bastions, once thought impregnable, would be bypassed and strangled. Their garrisons would wither on the vine, cut off from supplies, abandoned to hunger and disease. What seemed inconceivable in 1942 would become undeniable by 1944. The Pacific. Once Japan's empire was slipping away island by island, mile by mile, the jungle of Guadalcanal still echoed with gunfire. But the larger question lingered over the Pacific like a gathering storm. What hidden advantage had allowed the United States to turn ridicule into triumph, to strike so soon, so decisively, and with such enduring effect? The answer lay not only in bravery, but in steel, circuitry, and strategy, a secret edge that Japan could neither see nor stop. And in Section 2, that secret would be revealed. On the surface, the Americans had landed on Guadalcanal with nothing more than grit and numbers. But beneath the chaos of battle lay an unseen weapon, one that the Japanese neither respected nor feared until it was too late. It was not a gun, nor a tank, nor even a warship. It was a way of fighting, coordinated, networked, and powered by the hum of electricity. The Americans carried with them an advantage invisible to the eye, yet devastating on the battlefield. Portable radio communications, radar pickets, and a logistics machine that allowed entire armies to breathe in unison. Technical Manual TM 11-486, 1942. From the first days on Guadalcanal, Japanese officers noted a strange pattern. American artillery seemed to respond instantly to enemy movements. Patrols that slipped through the jungle at night found themselves bracketed by mortars within minutes. Marine positions shifted with uncanny precision, as if each man knew the other's thoughts. To the Japanese, this looked like luck, or perhaps hesitation, waiting until full firepower was mustered before striking. In truth, it was coordination, made possible by FM radios carried in the mud and rain by ordinary infantrymen. U.S. Marine Corps Field Report. Dark 1942. The Japanese relied on flag signals, runners, and field telephones strung through jungle vines, methods that collapsed under the weight of modern war. When a runner was cut down, a company vanished into silence. When a wire was snapped by shellfire, whole battalions fought blind. American units, by contrast, spoke across miles of dense jungle through the crackle of Motorola and SCR series sets, designed by engineers in Chicago and refined at the Signal Corps laboratories at Fort Monmouth. Bureau of Communications Development Report, 1941. These radios were waterproofed, battery-powered, and compact enough to ride in a Marine's pack. It was not only communication. Radar, still a young and imperfect science, began to shape the battles of the Solomons. Installed aboard American cruisers and destroyers, the SG and SC radar sets could see through night and fog, detecting Japanese ships long before they appeared on the horizon. To Admiral William Bull Halsey's task forces, this was nothing short of revolutionary. At Savo Island, where U.S. cruisers had been surprised and sunk in August 1942, Radar failures had contributed to disaster. But by late 1942, the technology matured, and Japanese night attacks lost their edge. Bureau of Ships Report, DEC 1942. The enemy could not believe what was happening. A captured Japanese naval officer reportedly exclaimed, "The Americans fight as if they see in the dark." For centuries, the Imperial Navy had prided itself on night fighting skill, honed in endless drills with searchlights and torpedoes. Now, that art was rendered obsolete by a box of circuits built in New Jersey. And still, Tokyo clung to denial, convinced that American victories were accidents, not the fruit of superior design. Interrogation of Japanese naval officers, 1945. Nowhere was this hidden advantage more vividly displayed than during the Battle of Tarawa, November 20th, 1943. At precisely 9 a.m., after hours of naval bombardment, the first wave of Marines surged toward the coral reefs that ringed Betio Island. The tide was low and landing craft grounded far from shore, forcing men to wade hundreds of yards under machine gun fire. For a moment, the assault teetered on the edge of catastrophe. But unlike the Japanese, whose defense relied on static bunkers and rigid orders, the Americans adapted in real time. Company radios called destroyers closer to blast pillboxes point blank. Forward observers, crouched in the surf with handsets pressed to their helmets, directed naval gunfire within yards of their own lines. Engineers rigged explosives under walls while officers coordinated second and third waves before the first had even reached the sand. The beach became a cauldron of smoke, blood, and debris, yet the entire operation moved with mechanical rhythm, guided by an invisible web of signals. By nightfall, Betio was scarred and smoking, but in American hands. U.S. Navy After-Action Report, Nov. 1943. Tarawa was hell. Nearly 1,000 Marines were killed in 76 hours, their bodies tangled in barbed wire and surf. But what stunned the Japanese was not the cost, it was the speed. A fortress garrisoned by 4,500 men, built with steel and concrete, and armed with heavy guns had been annihilated in 3 days. Japanese staff officers had predicted weeks of resistance, if not months. Instead, a single atoll had fallen to the Americans before Tokyo could even react. Imperial Army Dispatch, DEC, 1943. The reason lay in doctrine and technology entwined. Island hopping was not about brute conquest. It was about tempo, bypassing where possible and striking with overwhelming, synchronized force where necessary. Engineers in Pearl Harbor built specialized landing craft. The Higgins boats, the LVT, alligators, designed to scale reefs and disgorge troops under fire. Factory workers in Detroit riveted steel for Sherman tanks modified with flamethrowers, designed to burn out bunkers in seconds. Every new device came with a manual, a training program, and a signal plan to integrate it into the whole. Naval Engineering Division Report, 1943. The Japanese never matched this synergy. Their radios were few and fragile, their logistics stretched across a Pacific too vast for their merchant fleet. American convoys, by contrast, were orchestrated like symphonies. A Liberty ship could steam from San Francisco to Guadalcanal in less than 3 weeks, carrying thousands of tons of fuel, bombs, and canned food. Every crate was inventoried, every drum scheduled. Marines on Guadalcanal had starved, but by Tarawa and Kwajalein, supply discipline was tightening into a war-winning machine. Warshipping Administration Report, 1943. In combat, the results were brutal. At the Battle of Kwajalein, January 31st to February 3rd, 1944, the American 7th Infantry Division faced 8,000 Japanese defenders dug into bunkers and coconut log pillboxes. Radar-equipped naval vessels tracked enemy movements, while radios kept artillery and infantry in lockstep. Assault teams moved bunker by bunker, guided by real-time updates from platoon leaders connected to battalion command. The Japanese, cut off from reinforcement, fought with fanatical courage but in total isolation. By the 4th day, Kwajalein was secured, with 7,170 Japanese killed. American losses numbered 372 killed, an appalling toll, but a ratio that stunned even hardened commanders. U.S. Army Operations Report, Feb 1944. What Japanese generals had dismissed as American timidity was in reality precision, a doctrine of bypass and isolate, a toolkit of steel, circuits and engines, and a communication network that made every soldier more than a lone rifleman. He was a node in a living system of war. Tokyo never grasped this until it was too late, as one captured officer bitterly admitted after the war. "We did not understand that America fought as a single organism. We fought as scattered limbs." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The laughter that had echoed in 1942 was silenced by 1944. Island after island fell in weeks, sometimes days. Saipan, Tinian, Guam, each a step closer to Japan's homeland. And with every victory, the secret advantage grew stronger. Factories churned, radios multiplied, radar screens glowed brighter. The Pacific, once a Japanese lake, now churned with American steel, guided by signals that the enemy could neither jam nor match. But this advantage was more than tactical. It reshaped the entire war. It altered morale, strategy, and even the psychology of combat. In Section 3, we will see how this hidden edge not only crushed Japan's armies, but also rewrote the future of modern warfare, an echo that endures to this day. By the spring of 1944, the Pacific War was no longer defined by Japanese expansion. It was defined by Japanese contraction. Each island seized by the Americans became not merely a battlefield won, but a staging ground for the next leap forward. Saipan, Tinian, Guam, names that had once been whispered in Tokyo with pride, were now engraved in reports as defeats. And at the heart of each defeat lay a force the Japanese could not counter: America's ability to fight as a single, connected organism powered by communication, industry, and relentless logistics. Air Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The strategic implications of island hopping were devastating. Japan had built its empire on the belief that fortified bastions could halt an enemy advance. But island hopping made those bastions irrelevant. Bypassed and cut off, garrisons withered into starvation, unable to resupply across seas patrolled by submarines and carriers. At Truk, once the Gibraltar of the Pacific, American forces simply sailed past, isolating 45,000 Japanese troops. By war's end, those men were shadows surviving on rats, roots, and desperation. Their generals' laughter had turned into hollow silence. Imperial Army Dispatch, Jan, 1945. The psychological toll was immense. Japanese officers, once supremely confident, now reported a feeling of strangulation. Soldiers fought bravely, often to the death, but many knew their cause was doomed. Letters intercepted from the front spoke of despair, hunger, and disbelief at America's inexhaustible supplies. Where do they get such ships, such planes, such food? One soldier wrote before being killed on Peleliu, Captured Soldier's Letter, Sept. 1944. For every Japanese convoy that tried to run supplies to isolated garrisons, 10 were destroyed. Meanwhile, American morale, though battered by horrific casualties on Tarawa, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima, was sustained by knowledge of progress. Each island seized brought the homeland closer, within range of the long wings of the B-29 superfortress. Each captured airstrip meant fewer miles between bomber and target. And behind those miles stood the ordinary Americans whose hands built the arsenal. In Detroit, Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal tank plant churned out Sherman variants with flamethrowers. In Pennsylvania, Westinghouse workers assembled radar sets. In Chicago, Motorola technicians soldered radios for Marines they would never meet. They were not on the beaches, but their fingerprints were on every victory. War Production Board Bulletin, 1944. Even the maintenance of this advantage was staggering. Radios required spare parts, batteries, and trained operators. Radar demanded technicians at sea who could repair delicate vacuum tubes in the middle of a storm. Landing craft wore out after repeated beachings and had to be replaced by the thousands. Yet America's industrial system supplied them all, a conveyor belt of war that never stopped. Japanese forces, once proud of their resourcefulness, were overwhelmed by a foe whose strength was not improvisation, but infinite replenishment. U.S. Army Ordnance Report, 1944. The impact reached beyond strategy and logistics. It reshaped combat psychology itself. For Japanese troops, isolation bred despair. For Americans, connection bred confidence. A Marine crouching in a foxhole on Saipan could hear the voice of his commander through a radio handset, could call for artillery, could know that he was not alone. For Japanese soldiers, cut off by broken lines of communication, the war was fought in fragments, often without orders or reinforcement. Many died not in combat, but in silence, starving in jungles bypassed by island hopping. Naval Intelligence Report, Oct. 1944. When Saipan fell in July 1944, the consequences reverberated in Tokyo like an earthquake. For the first time, American bombers could strike the Japanese homeland itself. The Imperial General Headquarters reported the loss with shock, noting that the Empire's defense line has been penetrated. Imperial Army Dispatch, July 1944. Civilian morale plummeted. Confidence in military leadership eroded. Some officers whispered of inevitability, though to speak such thoughts aloud was treason. The psychological collapse accelerated at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history. Japanese admirals hurled what remained of their fleet against American convoys. But radar-directed firepower, carrier-based air groups and constant radio coordination shattered their formations. 4 Japanese carriers, 6 heavy cruisers and scores of destroyers went to the bottom. Survivors were left clinging to oil-slicked seas. The once proud Imperial Navy was finished. The Americans, with their talking ships and seeing radars, had annihilated centuries of naval tradition in 4 days. U.S. Navy Action Report. Oct. 1944. From that moment, Japan fought not for victory but for delay. Yet delay was futile. American bombers rose from newly captured airfields in the Marianas. B-29s roared over Tokyo, their bomb bays filled with incendiary destruction. The Japanese people, once told the war was distant, now watched their cities burn. "We are being consumed island by island, city by city," a Japanese civilian diary lamented. Tokyo Diary, March 1945. Even as American forces closed in, the human cost remained staggering. At Iwo Jima, 70,000 Marines faced 21,000 Japanese defenders in February 1945. Radios and artillery coordination turned the volcanic rock into a killing ground, yet the defenders fought with suicidal resolve. Nearly all perished, while 6,121 Americans were killed in the process. U.S. Marine Corps After Action Report, Feb. 1945. And at Okinawa, the last great battle, more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers and 12,000 Americans were killed, alongside tens of thousands of civilians. Army Operations Report, June 1945. But even in those blood-soaked final months, the pattern never changed. Coordination, communication, and logistics gave America the edge. Japanese generals, once mocking the very idea of American island hopping, now watched as their empire collapsed in less than 2 years. The laughter of 1942 had turned into silence, then into ashes. The legacy of island hopping did not end in 1945. Its lessons carried into the Cold War, shaping NATO doctrine of rapid deployment and networked coordination. Radios became transistors, then satellites. Radar became digital, then spaceborne. The principle remained: connection outweighed firepower. The ability to coordinate across distance, to strike in rhythm, defined modern war. In the Gulf War of 1991, American forces again advanced with lightning speed, guided by radios, satellites, and computers, a direct descendant of the system tested in the jungles of the Pacific. U.S. Army War College analysis, in 1992. For Japan, the legacy was sobering. Post-war leaders studied the collapse and concluded that industrial power and communications had mattered as much as courage. The lesson was seared into their national memory. Never again would they underestimate the machinery of modern war. And for the men who fought, the memory was personal. Marines who had starved on Guadalcanal, who had clawed through coral at Tarawa, who had raised a flag over Iwo Jima, carried with them not only scars, but pride. They had seen how laughter turned into fear, how arrogance crumbled into ruin. One American veteran put it simply decades later: "We didn't win because we were braver. The Japanese were brave as hell. We won because we were connected. Every man, every ship, every plane, one heartbeat. one voice. In the end, the laughter of Japanese generals in 1942 was drowned out by the roar of American engines, the crackle of radios, and the thunder of a nation's industrial heart. In less than 2 years, the Pacific was transformed. The rising sun had been eclipsed, and the world had learned a lesson as enduring as war itself. In modern conflict, unity of will and unity of signal can topple empires.